Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar with Margot Note. My name is Bradley, and I will be your moderator for Archivists and Records Managers, the dynamic duo. Before we start, I would like to provide some information about our company and introduce today's presenter. Lucidea is a software developing company specialized in museum and archival collections management solutions, as well as knowledge management and library automation systems. Our brands include Sydney, Presto, Argus, Archivera, Eloquent, and Quadristar. Now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Margot Note. Margot Note is an author, archivist, and records manager, helping individuals and organizations harness their history. As the principal of Margot Note Consulting LLC, she facilitates the understanding of the importance of unique collections, suggesting ways to manage them and use them to tell stories to connect with people. She is also a popular guest author for Lucidea's Think Clearly blog and has provided us with many great webinars that are listed on our website, so please feel free to check those out after today's session. Take it away, Margot.
Thank you so much. So it's this is kind of a passion project for me, and I came to Lucidea to talk about kind of archives and records managers because I certainly see, just speaking personally from my own experience, by understanding records management, I'm a better archivist, and by understanding archives, I'm a better records manager as well. I always think of kind of archives and records managers. Records management is kind of cousins that grew up together in the same family. They're not brother and sister. There's a lot of differences, but there's definitely a lot of kind of shared traits. And I think sometimes professionally we're very separate from each other. And I think if we have a better understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses, I think ultimately it results in a better records retention program, but also a better archives too. So, kind of the shared tasks that we all have as records managers and archivists is to obviously identify records. So the records manager is doing a records inventory. They're seeing, let's say, the types of records that are happening and where that fits in on the records retention schedule. As archivists, we're also identifying records of enduring value, and appraising them as they transfer over to the archives, and really thinking about what is the historical value, the intrinsic and evidentiary values that these records hold. We both care about the physical integrity of both analog records and electronic records. So making sure there's authenticity, there's integrity. These records are not damaged either. They're physically, thinking about environmental controls for physical records as well as digital preservation for digital records. And then thinking also of preserving the intellectual integrity. So thinking about, what do these records contain? What do they mean? What is the context that they have? And really preserving the information that they hold. So you kind of move from data to information to knowledge, and I would even say wisdom that you're collecting from these records. So another thing that we share is obviously an understanding of legislation and regulations that affect us. Both records managers and archivists are concerned with disposal, so making sure that we're effectively, getting rid of records when we're supposed to be getting rid of them. We're doing it in a safe way, that we're not just throwing them out in the trash, we're shredding them, or if there's records on, let's say, computer equipment, that we're disposing them in both an environmental safe way, but also in a way that destroys that information so it can't be retrieved. We're interested in privacy, so thinking about, as records managers, we're thinking about things like personal identifiable information, personal health information, social security numbers. On the archives end as well, we're definitely thinking of those same issues, but also thinking about the privacy of the people that have created the records too, and kind of what rights they hold. And then copyright is an important aspect too. So obviously, if records are created in-house by an organization that's work for profit or work for hire, so in that case, the organization owns that information. It's not like it's copywritten to the individual author. And then again, in archives, we think about copyright in the sense of, if there's a signed deed of gift, for example, that the copyright is owned by that repository, then they can distribute the information, digitize the information, put it online in a way that allows them to share that information without having to think about the rights held by other creators. And if you think about records, the records life cycle, so thinking about the creation of records, the active use of records, the inactive use, and ultimately the disposition. So it either goes to the archives or it gets destroyed in some way. And typically about 3 to 5% of records created by an organization have that enduring value, that permanent value in the life of the organization that would be saved in the archives, while 95% to 97% are ultimately going to be retained, and then they're going to be destroyed. So obviously, if you think about that life cycle, the records managers obviously kind of initiate that life cycle in a way that they're looking at the creation of records. They're making sure that these records um, are inventoried for the records retention schedule, and then the archivists are at the other end of that life cycle. So thinking about of the records that come into their custody, they appraise those records even further to see what's worth saving. Now, obviously, that life cycle that would make in a purely physical world, if the digital world did not exist, the records managers at the start and the archivists at the end that would maintain. Obviously, with digital records, because they are more easily corruptible, that the preservation of these records require archivists to be kind of much more closer to that creation part of the life cycle. So we're not seeing archivists as kind of these passive receivers of information, but getting much more involved in that life cycle to make sure that, let's say, something that was created today on Microsoft Word is going to be usable and savable 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and thinking about, like, will Microsoft exist then, et cetera, et cetera. So there is this forked path. So obviously the life cycle happens, and then things are going to the archives and things are going to be disposed of. So there's elimination of records without enduring value. So really thinking about the retention period of these records are overdue and they can be safely destroyed. And then really thinking about, of all the galaxy of information that's being created, of all the records that are being created, what are things that have enduring value that would be useful to keep in the long term, that wouldn't, let's say, cause risks to the organization, but would give us kind of a historical context about the activities and the functions of the organization. So that's where, archivists and records manager obviously really differ. There's obviously an interdependence, and I see in my consulting practice is that whenever there is, let me step back. If there's a strong records management program, that there is a records retention schedule, that there is someone, either a records manager or someone in some position doing some type of records management, like things are being identified and destroyed over time, and there's some type of buy-in from leadership, so there's kind of a strong records management, then the archives program tends to be stronger, because archivists cannot create miracles as much as as much as people would like us to do that. We can't control all the records that happen within an organization. We can safely preserve and give access to the records that have meaning, that have enduring value, but we can't do it all. It's not a one person job or a one department job. So I see in my consulting practice, whenever there's kind of an archives program that seems to be floundering a little bit, I always look at the records management piece, even though it's funny how many organizations think of them as totally separate. And I see that there's a very weak records management program. It's basically a records retention schedule that someone cut and pasted in the administrator's office, and it has no meaning. There's no training in records management. No one's really giving things to the archives unless, let's say, they're cleaning out a closet or an office. And so that's where I really see that interdependence, that we really, as archivists, we really have to lean heavily on records managers to make our life easier. And I think the same way to a lesser extent, the records managers I think appreciate archivists that are there, that are another seat at the table, that can really articulate the value of why we're keeping these records. So it's not I see, and maybe this is the chip that I have on my shoulder, but I see non-archivists and non-records managers really not understanding that the work that we do, they think we're maybe clerks. They think it is very clerical, is kind of record keeping, and frankly kind of beneath them. I mean, that's what kind of the impression I get talking to people sometimes. So it is really nice to have kind of both records managers and archivists that kind of get each other and understand the purpose of what we're doing. So obviously there's huge differences between the fields as well. There's cultural, societal, and historical. I'll talk a little bit about those differences, but it's funny, I was just coming back from, I'm part of the exam development committee for the certified records manager's exam, and I work in part 6, which is a case study that you have to read and respond to. But it was interesting to be hanging out with a bunch of records managers, which I haven't done in a very long time because we've all been doing it obviously virtual for the last 2 years. So it was nice to see people and interact with people, and they are very different. Records managers are very different than archivists. Um, and let me go into those differences. So obviously our focus is completely different. And that's where I think there's this kind of nice tension in the best possible way, like that exists between both our fields, because obviously records managers, yeah, they're focused on destruction. They're looking at that records retention schedule and saying, once this records group reaches its destruction time, or the end of the retention, not a minute afterwards, we should, set it to be shredded or to be deleted. And that's very much focused on organizing what's there, making it retrievable and usable for active and inactive use, but then destroying. Well, obviously, archivists are looking at it a totally different way. They're saying, how can we not only save these records from being destroyed, but how can we preserve them? How can we preserve both their kind of their physical traits, but in the digital, say migration, or changing the file formats to make sure that they're in a more proprietary state. So there is this kind of nice tension that exists between both fields. I mean, that's the obvious difference. The records management emphasis is obviously on business practices, administrative uses, and a legal necessity. And so what I like as an archivist is to, if people aren't if my clients or whoever I'm talking to don't really get the value of archives, and they're kind of corporate types or business types, it's really helpful for me to talk about records management, because they tend to get that a little bit better, especially if you talk about it from the legal aspect. So thinking about risk mitigation. Obviously, you don't want to over retain records for a multitude of reasons, like let's say for storage and for cost, but also for the huge amount of risk and liability that it has an organization. Because obviously, if someone was going to sue, or there was going to be some type of discovery of records, your organization is basically saving records that they have to give over to the opposing counsel, and that they're going to use against the organization. And obviously, the more records that you have, the more ammunition you give them, because a smart lawyer is going to look at any documentation, be able to um, figure out an angle. Um, so records management is much more kind of focused on the business processes and thinking about the administrative. And I think that's kind of where they differ from obviously archivists that tend to be a little bit more academic. Their records management managers are much more corporate. But I think that's kind of good too. It gives a nice balance to kind of information governance in total. They're also thinking about efficiency of retrieval of useful documents. So obviously we're keeping records that are the most final version. We're not keeping different, we're doing version control, for example. We're not over retaining tons and tons of documents where we only need kind of a sliver that are active. It's thinking about productivity too. So how can we find this information, being accurate information, not, you know, and then thinking about a competitive advantage. And this happens even in nonprofits. I'm using a lot of kind of corporate speak because a lot of records management is related to businesses, but there is a competitive advantage of having good records management, that you have the records that you have. You're reducing costs, you're reducing storage, you're making sure that nothing's over retained, so there's no legal risk as well. There's also strategic value, so having information that you can make some decision making. There's a profit increase. I would also say cost reduction too. I think sometimes we focus obviously on making profit, but there's something to be said about cost reduction. So that can be just as profitable if you can reduce those costs and storage fees and time wasted by employees trying to find information and getting information wrong and pulling the wrong document for an audit and possibly being fined or being threatened of being fined. And of course, risk management. So really thinking are protected as an organization. So the point of view that records management tends to give is obviously they want to destroy records at the earliest possible time. Again, 1 minute after the record's retention, it should be sent to the shredder. Or at least it's scheduled for that, knowing what should be destroyed and when. I think sometimes there's a little bit of perspective as archivists as being hoarders, like thinking about, do archivists really need this information? And thinking about, I think records more as items or as types rather than the context, the way that archivists think about it. Or they can think of archivists as a bit of a liability risk. So obviously, if you're keeping records that are longer than the retention period, there is some risk there. So you have to balance, like, is it worth, keeping documents a little bit longer in the archives because they have information that would be historically useful, that they have potential enduring value, or should we destroy them when we can destroy them? And that's, I think, where records management is coming in with their point of view. On the opposite end is archivists tend to be very academic. So if you think about all of the literature, obviously is coming from university and college archives, which for first off, they're obviously the logical place where many archives live, that archives of both the institution themselves, but then they can be a collecting archive. So they're taking their donors' materials they can collect in different areas. So obviously they represent a big piece of the pie. Archivists or people that work in archives can also have to worry about tenure, so they have to publish for the profession. So obviously they're writing about their archives, and they have the time and they can have the sabbatical or whatever a lot time allotted to them to write for the profession. So obviously we hear more about university and college archives. I'd also say too that university and college archives have a good labor force that's built in of undergraduates and graduates. So they have, an interested workforce, a relatively um, low cost to employ this workforce, and they can get grants related to their work too. So in all these areas, obviously archives are really influenced by academic. I think it's also um, I think people that are drawn to archives are more thinking about kind of inspirational and they're thinking about records as evidence. They're kind of, I would say they're kind of have loftier ideals than, let's say, records managers who tend to be a little bit grittier, I think. And I think archivists tend to be political in the sense that they're thinking about collecting um, unrepresented voices, where I think records managers are much more thinking about what's on the records retention schedule, or archivists are thinking about what is a more representative history. And sometimes that means not only receiving records that are transferred over from records management, but actually going out and creating connections with the community or with potential donors, or oral history projects where they're actually creating the stories, or programs where there's kind of field archivists or community archivists, like Archives in a Backpack that's from UNC, I believe. So, there's different ways that there's gathering of the context, and they're thinking more about the representation of history, much more fuller than records managers are. Obviously, a big theme of archives are preservation. I think that's kind of number one, followed very closely by access. So obviously, a records manager is not really thinking necessarily of access beyond the access of the records of people within the organization, where archivists sometimes are thinking about access of enduring records to both people within the organization, but also outside researchers as well. And what does that look like? Is that totally open access where anyone that has a research request can come in and look at the materials? Does it mean that they have to be vetted? And another theme is context. So records managers, individual or and kind of records retention like lines in a records retention schedule, where archivists are thinking about the context. So they're not thinking about individual materials as much as what does that mean? As archivists, we always think at the group level. So that could be folder or box or record group or series or subseries, but we're also thinking about what is the context of all these documents talking to each other as primary sources. What does that actually mean? What can we infer from that as researchers or historians? Archives are also concerned with selection, so thinking about appraisal of the collection. So obviously the records retention schedule says that some materials can move on to the archives, but again, looking at those materials and looking and understanding that only a small sliver of that the records that an organization creates can be saved. That that's also kind of an ethical, and it's kind of funny. I run into this with some clients. It's like some people would like to save everything, but ethically, if you're saying that you're preserving something and you're selecting it, like, you can't just take on everything. Obviously, you have to make some hard decisions about what you can take on and preserve into history, into the future. Archives are also thinking about kind of diversity and inclusion. So again, thinking about kind of the broader picture of an organization or an event or a community. And sometimes that means that there can't just be passive receiving of records. Sometimes that means kind of active looking out for records. And then thinking about outreach and education. So records managers are thinking about kind of training of staff, but archivists are thinking more about outreach and education. So how can we tell people about these collections? How can we help them access them better? How can we work as kind of reference or research archivists to help people with looking for the records that they're seeking out? From the point of view of the transfer of the materials when they're no longer active. So there is kind of some distance between these records that I think it can be kind of a healthy distance of when the records are no longer being used or even inactively used. I think sometimes archivists can see records managers as kind of denying access, or um, more kind of sticklers, where I think records managers think more in black and white, and this is like a very big um, overall view. I think archivists can see things as kind of different stages of gray, or different levels of gray. So records manager users are thinking about kind of legal evidence of these records, like what does that mean, and the administrative information that they contain. And archives users are more concerned with kind of finding knowledge and looking at past events, people, and organizations, kind of making sense of these materials. And archives also um, are thinking about the evidence. So the records and context provide kind of an insight into the events. So their primary source is, what does this mean? And kind of also thinking, like looking, doing a close reading of a document, for example, you're really thinking about who wrote this document, what were they trying to say, what particularly biases that they have or perspectives that they have, you can help read into the materials as well. And the evidential values for records management are obviously looking at kind of the legal aspect, the fiscal aspect, and the administrative purposes. So thinking about, if we need a record as evidence in a legal matter, in something regarding a fiscal matter, like are these records, do they have integrity? Are they have authenticity that can be used as evidential, and can we preserve that over the long term? And obviously the administrative purposes of looking back at these records and using them. And then the evidential values for archives are more looking at kind of the cultural perspective of these materials. Obviously, the historical view. Archivists are looking at these records in much more um, kind of placing them in a historical context and looking at, what are other events that were happening at the time that we can, now we're in the future, how can we look back and provide more context to whatever this record's talking about, and also have some social perspectives. And what I really find helpful is a records continuum model, because it does really represent kind of a shift in thinking, where I think traditionally we had records management and archives still had that life cycle, again, where records managers are here at the start and archivists are at the end, and they don't really interact much. But I think in this kind of modern information environment with kind of digital records and the need for digital preservation, there's a lot more movement, where I think there's more talking with records managers and archivists to make sure, like, are we supporting the same? Are we at odds with each other? Or are we supporting the same goals? And I think it really does link the profession, and especially regarding digital records. And I thinking of a client that is a county archives. So they obviously have a ton of government regulations and a lot of transparency and a lot of rules that they have to follow in order to have um, to preserve these records in the long term. And they were talking about, as archivists, are really talking to the records managers and really thinking about the records creators that are in these different agencies of the county, and really having a discussion with everyone at the start, because people have traditionally understood records management in this environment because it is very um, it's government, so it's very regulated, and it's been like a long-term understanding of records management, not so much the archives piece. So what she was saying is that she has seen in her profession that it just seems like she's having these conversations about the archives early and earlier in the life cycle, and really kind of starting to talking to these agencies at the start of when they're creating um, materials. And it was really interesting how she mentioned too that it really depends on, not everyone, even after the pandemic, not everyone is adapting to digital, like born digital documents. She's finding that, for example, when they're surveying done, because the surveying staff tends to be a little bit older, that they're still using the paper record. So that is um, or paper blueprints and records. That is the enduring value versus something that's created by younger people with whatever software that they're using. So it is really interesting to see that shift that happens with digital preservation, and how hopefully these professions are getting linked even closer. So again, there's definitely an interconnection. There's a common understandings and consistent standards and best practices. I see just in my consulting practice, I should say, I, I started out as an archivist, and I started getting into records management because I just knew having a better understanding of that would make me a better archivist. I also saw it more as a I mean, this is when I was working like um, when I wasn't consulting, when I was like in a typical 9 to 5, I saw it as another kind of feather in my cap, just to be like, okay, if there's kind of precarious labor in archives, I might move over to records management if I can find a position that makes sense. So for me, it was a kind of a natural progression. I see people going from archives to records management. I don't necessarily see people going from records management to archives, which I think is interesting. I think that has to do more with the availability of jobs and the precarious nature of archival work. But we obviously share a lot of standards and best practices. And I find, and I should put in a little plug because I was talking about creating the exam for certified records managers. I've also found that doing the exam for certified to become a certified archivist and doing the exam to be a certified records manager, again, those are two things that I mean, I say everyone should strive for. I think it just makes, again, it gives you studying for these exams and getting certified and maintaining that certification really does make you more understanding of the profession, and it keeps you on your toes, especially as things change. And obviously, technology is changing, but I think also how we think about records is also changing too. The same thing about how we think about history is also always changing because we're always discovering more. So that's my little plug for certification of both fields. So obviously the critical points are the creation and disposition. Those are where in the records management life cycle is where we're really seeing both archivists and records managers really kind of come up to the plate and be involved in that process. Typically, I think we take a backseat approach to, our donors can, or records creators can, create records and do everything that they're doing, and we're kind of a bit hands off. But those are the two critical points that I think it's helpful for records managers and archivists to be involved in that process. And so what archivists want, it's funny, when I was preparing this presentation, I was talking to a few people and getting a sense of both records managers and archivists about how they get a sense of each other. And I think in summary, what I heard is that what archivists want is the ability to go off schedule to get a fuller picture. I think sometimes with that records retention schedule, it can be very black and white, and as it should be. I mean, there shouldn't be any, it should be clear to understand. But sometimes it's nice to have a little things that are off schedule, to over retain a little bit for the archives to get that fuller historical picture. They also think that kind of simplified file code systems and limited record series with different retention dates. What I see is sometimes the records retention schedules can be created, let's say, by a law firm, people that are really into the nitty gritty, that are billing you to get into the nitty gritty, but it's not very realistic about how your average employee works with records. They're not going to be looking at a very complex records retention schedule. And this is where I think records management, when they talk about big buckets, I think where that really comes into play, where it should be these record series and there's a retention of 3 years, 7 years, 10 years, and maybe longer, and then permanent. Like there shouldn't be, it shouldn't be like 30 days past whatever. Like sometimes what I should say with records retention schedules that I see, sometimes they get so in the weeds and the details of what has to be retained that it's just not very realistic. It would be far better to have a records retention that's slightly longer if it's consistent than to have um, this granular nature of the schedule or the retention dates. And then also archivists, again, are looking for context. We want to see, what does this document mean in the slew of other documents? What do these records mean together? That's where we're looking for information. We're not looking at things that live in a vacuum. We're always looking at the context of information in its environment. So regarding sustainability, obviously, as I was saying before, archivists and records manager have to coexist in digital preservation. They have to talk to each other if we're going to save documents in the long term. And obviously, technology requires the early archival intervention. And there's also a need for information on the creation process and the context. So the more that archivists know from the beginning of that records creation, the better it's going to be when that record eventually finds its way to the archives. And some lasting or ending questions, I would say, and I'm kind of asking these rhetorically, I don't necessarily have the answers. How can archivists and records managers understand their priorities, and how can they strengthen their relationship? I feel, again, going back to this idea of kind of cousins that grew up together, I think archivists and records managers tend to be, we share so much. Um, but yet we're really not playing with each other as much as we should. I find personally in my consulting business that organizations aren't necessarily looking for archives help. They're not looking for archives help or records management help, or either both, or both of them. They're looking for someone to help them wrangle their information. So I think sometimes we as professionals, I mean, as is our right, because we're passionate about it, we get kind of involved too much in the technicalities and the jargon, and kind of in some ways in our own world. Or I think to reach people, to reach everyday people and organizations and repositories, we have to be better at articulating our value and talking about why it matters to them, and kind of getting away from, we can have our kind of philosophical questions about the nature of records and evidence, but it's really like, what does that mean for an organization? What does that mean for decision makers that can decide we need records management or we need archives? That's where I think we can both um, strengthen them to talk about our value, both as records managers and archivists.
Thank you, Margot, for the wonderful presentation. And we're also very excited to announce that you can download a copy of Margot's latest book from our website, The Digital Decisive Moment, Transformative Digitization Practices. So please feel free to head over to our website and get a copy if you wish. And if you'd like to learn more about our archival collections management system called Archivera, please feel free to visit our website as well, or reach out to us at sales@lucidea.com, and we would be happy to have a chat with you. If you have any more questions on any of our software or our company, our contact details are listed on the screen, and please stay tuned for more webinars and content related to this series. And on behalf of the Lucidea team, I thank you all for attending, and until next time, thanks.